I learned to trust my shield before I ever trusted my courage. The steel is simple. It holds or it breaks. Courage is a more complicated thing, a flickering candle in the soul that you pray the wind does not find. I was a footman in the Argent Crusade, stationed at the edge of the world's deepest scar, and my shield was a round of scarred comfort against the encroaching dark. Our post was a place called Hearthglen, a bastion of stubborn light against the suffocating gloom of the western Plaguelands, a name that still tasted like ash on the tongue. My days began not with a rooster's crow, but with the doleful, distant tolling of a chapel bell. It was a sound less of hope and more of grim persistence. Before the sun had even troubled the bruised purple of the horizon, I was awake on my cot, the straw mattress rustling like dry bones. The air in the barracks was always cold, thick with the scent of old leather, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of blade oil. I would lie there for a moment, listening to the breathing of the 20 other men in the long, stone room. Some slept soundly, but most, like me, were restless, their sleep haunted by the land we had sworn to cleanse. The first ritual of my day was simple. I would reach for the worn leather straps of my shield, propped against the wall beside me. My fingers would trace the deep gouges in its face, each a memory of a ghoul's claw, a necromancer's bolt, a bandit's desperate axe. It was a map of my survival. The morning routine was a testament to discipline over despair. We would file out into the pre-dawn chill of the courtyard, our breath pluming in the air. The flagstones were perpetually damp, slick with a dew that felt unnaturally cold. Sergeant Boros would be there waiting for us, a mountain of man whose face was a roadmap of forgotten campaigns. He never shouted. He never needed to. His presence was enough, a silent demand for perfection. Armor first, he would grumble, his voice like stones grinding together. The light protects the soul, but steel protects the body. See to the steel first. We would spend the first hour in a meticulous ritual of maintenance, checking every strap, polishing every plate, using whetstones on our blades until the edges were sharp enough to shave with. It was a meditative act, a way of focusing the mind on the tangible, the controllable. You could not control the blight, but you could control the keenness of your sword. Hearthglen itself was a paradox. Within its high stone walls, there was a semblance of life. The chapel stood tall, its stained glass windows depicting saints and heroes of a bygone age, a defiant splash of color against the unrelenting gray of the sky. Priests and paladins walked the grounds, their polished armor gleaming, their litanies a constant, humming undercurrent to the clang of the forge and the shouts of training squires. There was a garden, tended by a quiet priestess named Alara, where she coaxed stubborn, pale vegetables from the reluctant soil. It was a small patch of green in a world of brown and gray, and we all felt a fierce, unspoken need to protect it. But just beyond the walls, the world was dying. The great trees of the old Tirisful glades were skeletal claws reaching for a sky that offered no comfort. The ground was a tapestry of sickly greens and purples, and the air carried a perpetual scent of decay, a sweet, cloying odor that clung to the back of your throat. I had been born in a village not far from here, a place that no longer existed on any map. It had a name once, but that name was buried under rubble and restless spirits. I fought in these lands not for a king or a grand cause, but for a memory. The memory of sunlight on a wheat field, the sound of my mother's laughter, the solid feel of my father's hand. These were the things the Scourge had consumed, and I was here to reclaim the echoes. My faith in the light was not like Alara's, a brilliant, unwavering sun. Mine was a guttering torch I carried into a deep cavern, a small thing that I had to shield with my own hands to keep it from being extinguished by the suffocating darkness and the chilling drafts of doubt. It was a practical faith born of necessity. I had seen the light turn a ghoul to ash. I had felt its warmth mend a wound that should have been fatal. It was real. It was a tool, a weapon like my sword and shield, and I would use it. Our squad was a microcosm of the crusade itself. There was Sergeant Boros, the old bull who had fought since the Second War. His faith was in his men and the strength of a well-formed shield wall. Alara, the priestess, was young, her eyes still holding a fire that had been banked to embers in most of us. She saw the good in reclaiming this land, the holy duty. For her, every inch of cleansed soil was a prayer answered. Then there was Gunnar, a dwarf from Ironforge, a volunteer who had come north seeking, as he put it, a proper bloody mess to clean up. His faith was in black powder and good dwarven steel. He was a rifleman, his long gun a constant companion, and his wry, grim humor was often the only thing that kept our spirits from sinking into the blighted mud. And there was me, Kalen, the footman, the anchor of the line, the one whose job it was to simply stand and endure. We trained relentlessly. The courtyard would ring with the clash of steel as we practiced formations. The shield wall was our catechism. We learned to lock our shields so tightly that not even a whisper of wind could pass between them. We learned to trust the man on our left and the man on our right more than we trusted our own eyes. Boros would walk the line, his heavy mace tapping against a shield that was too high, a stance that was too wide. "The wall is one entity," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "It breathes together. It stands together. It breaks together. Do not be the crack that lets the darkness in." We would drill until our arms ached and our bodies screamed, until the movements were instinct, until the shield felt like an extension of my own bone and sinew. In the evenings, if we were not on watch, we would gather in the mess hall. The food was bland, stew, hard bread, watery ale, but it was hot and it was shared. It was in these moments that the facade of the stoic soldier would crack. Men would speak quietly of homes they had not seen in years, of families they prayed were still safe. Gunnar would tell loud, boisterous stories of mountain halls and dragons, his voice a welcome thunder in the quiet hall. Alara would sometimes read from the holy texts, her clear voice a balm on weary souls. I rarely spoke of my past. It was a locked room inside me, and I did not have the key nor the desire to find it. I would sit and listen, cleaning my gear, my hands finding comfort in the familiar tasks. The kinship was unspoken, but deeply felt. We were survivors, bound together by a shared duty and a shared proximity to death. We were a family forged in the crucible of a blighted world. Life settled into a rhythm of vigilance and waiting. We patrolled the lands immediately surrounding Hearthglen, clearing out the shambling, mindless undead that wandered too close. These were skirmishes, not battles. Disjointed ghouls, clumsy skeletons, the occasional bloated abomination that required concentrated effort to bring down. It was grim work, but it was necessary. It was like weeding a garden, Alara once said, pulling up the corruption so that something new could one day grow. I found the analogy difficult. The weeds we pulled were once people. Farmers, merchants, children from Lordaeron. Every time I drove my sword through a rotted chest, I would see a flicker of a face, a remnant of a life stolen. Boros had taught me to shut that part of my mind down. "You are not killing a person, lad," he had told me once, after a particularly hard patrol. "You are granting them peace. You are ending their torment. See it as a mercy, and your arm will not falter." But there were nights when sleep would not come. I would climb the battlements and look out over the Plaguelands. Under the cold, distant light of the twin moons, the land looked deceptively peaceful, a rolling sea of silvered hills and skeletal forests. But I knew what was out there. I could feel it, a malevolent intelligence, a patient evil that was not content with what it had already taken. The Scourge was not a mindless horde. It was a weapon, and though its master had been defeated in Northrend, fragments of it will remain, festering in the dark places of the world. Sometimes I thought I could hear whispers on the wind, faint and insidious, promises of power, of an end to pain. It was the song of the land itself, a dirge of corruption. On those nights, I would grip the cold stone of the wall, recite the tenets of the light, and pray for the dawn. The dawn always came. That was the one promise the world still kept. This routine, this grim cycle of duty and watchfulness was our life. It was a hard life, a life lived on a knife's edge, but it was ours. We held the line. We were the flickering candle against an infinite night. We endured, and we waited. We waited for the day when our duty would call us out, beyond the familiar, weed-choked fields and into the deeper, darker heart of the Plaguelands, where the true secrets, the true terrors, lay sleeping, waiting for someone to be foolish enough to wake them. We all knew that day would come. It was not a matter of if, but when. We just prayed we would be ready when it did. The bell tolled. Another day began, and I picked up my shield, its weight a familiar burden, a familiar comfort. The steel was simple. It would hold, or it would break. And so would I. The summons came on a morning thick with a fog that clung to the ground like a shroud. It was an unnatural mist, cold and carrying the faint, foul scent of an open grave. It deadened sound, making the usual morning clangor of the keep feel distant and muffled. We were in the midst of our morning drills when the horn blew from the watchtower, a single, urgent blast that was not part of any scheduled call. It was the signal for an emergency. We froze, hands tightening on our weapons. Sergeant Boros's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the walls. "Form up," he barked, the command cutting through the fog. "For the main gate. Move." There was no panic, only a swift, disciplined rush to our posts. We had trained for this moment 1,000 times. At the gate, a scene of grim urgency was unfolding. A lone rider had collapsed just inside the portcullis, his horse lathered and trembling. He was one of ours, a scout from the Argent Vanguard. He was barely alive. His leathers were torn, and a festering, black wound marred his side, pulsing with a sickly green light. Alara was there in an instant, her hands glowing with the light's holy energy as she knelt beside him. But even from distance, I could see it was too late. The blight was too deep, the corruption too absolute. The man was delirious, his words a desperate, broken torrent. Scholomance, a new master. They're not just raising the dead, they're building them. He coughed a spray of black ichor, and his eyes rolled back. Alara's light flickered and died as the life left him. She stayed there for a moment, head bowed, a silent prayer for a soul already lost. High Lord Fordring himself came down from the keep's command center. His presence commanded an immediate, reverent silence. He looked at the fallen scout, his face a mask of grim resolve. He conferred quietly with the captain, who then turned to Boros. Orders were exchanged in low, clipped tones. I watched Boros's face. It remained impassive, but I saw a subtle tightening around his jaw, a hardening in his eyes. He had been given a task, and it was not a simple one. He turned to face our squad, which had gathered nearby. "Gear up," he said, his voice low but carrying to every one of us. "Full combat load. Rations for 3 days. We have our orders." He looked at each of us in turn. At me, at Gunnar, who was checking the firing mechanism of his rifle, and at Alara, who was rising from the side of the dead scout, her face pale, but her expression firm. "We're going east, toward Corrin's Crossing." The name fell like a stone in the quiet courtyard. Corrin's Crossing, a ruined town that had been a contested zone for years, a place where Scourge remnants and zealous Scarlet Crusaders fought their endless, pointless battles. It was a place sane people avoided. The scouts' mention of Scholomance was even more chilling. The vile academy of necromancy was thought to be largely contained, its leadership shattered. If a new master had risen there, if they were experimenting with the blight as the scout had gasped, it was a threat that could not be ignored. We were to be the eyes and ears of the crusade, a reconnaissance mission into the heart of the rot. Find out what this new threat was, assess its strength, and report back. Do not engage unless necessary. The last part was always said, and always the first to be disregarded when steel was drawn. There was no grand speech, no call to glory. Duty was a quieter, heavier thing. We gathered our supplies in a practiced silence. I checked the straps on my shield for the 3rd time, packed extra whetstones, and secured my bedroll. Alara filled her satchel with blessed bandages and vials of holy water, her movements precise and deliberate. Gunnar, ever the pragmatist, packed extra ammunition and a block of hard, pungent cheese he claimed could survive any apocalypse. He caught my eye and gave a grim, tight-lipped smile. "Well, lad," he grunted, patting the stock of his rifle. "At least it's not another patrol chasing mindless ghouls." A proper bit of trouble, for once. His attempt at levity was a thin cloak over the tension we all felt. We knew what this was. This was not weeding the garden. This was marching into the heart of the Blight. Before we left, we stood before the chapel entrance. It was a tradition for squads heading into the deep wilds. Alara stepped forward and spoke a short, simple blessing. "May the light be your shield and your sword. May it guide your feet on the shadowed path and bring you safely home to this hearth." She touched the Argent Crusade insignia on each of our pauldrons, a silver hand against a golden sun. When her fingers touched my armor, I felt a faint, fleeting warmth spread through the cold steel, a small comfort against the chill that had settled deep in my bones. It was a warmth that felt like a memory of hope, a fragile thing in this land of despair. Boros gave the final command. "Let's move." He did not look back. None of us did. We marched out of the main gate, the heavy iron portcullis groaning shut behind us, a sound of finality. The fog was beginning to thin, but the world it revealed was no less grim. The path eastward was little more than a suggestion, a track of churned mud and broken stones that wound its way through skeletal trees and over hills the color of old bruises. The oppressive silence of the Plaguelands descended upon us, broken only by the rhythmic tramp of our boots, the jingle of our armor, and the whistling of a wind that felt like a dead man's sigh. The summons had come. Our quiet days of waiting were over. We were now in the grasp of the land itself, and it did not welcome us. We were a tiny flicker of light and steel, marching deliberately into an ocean of shadows, and all we had to rely on was our training, our faith, and the person marching beside us. The march was a descent. With every league we put between ourselves and Hearthglen, the land grew more twisted, more openly hostile. The sickly greens and purples of the Blight deepened into angry, gangrenous hues. The skeletal trees were no longer just bare. They were warped into agonized shapes, their branches like twisted limbs reaching for a sky permanently veiled in a sickly, gray haze. The air grew thick, heavy with the stench of ancient decay and something else, something sharper and more chemical, like ozone and spoiled alchemy. The silence became profound. There were no birds, no insects, not even the rustle of a rat in the undergrowth. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. We moved in a tight diamond formation. Boros at the point, his heavy tower shield a bulwark against the path ahead. Gunnar and I were on the flanks, our heads on a constant swivel, scanning the dead ridges and hollows. Alara was in the center, protected, her mace in one hand, a holy symbol clutched in the other. Her presence was a quiet focus, a pool of calm in the tense watchfulness that surrounded her. We communicated with hand signals Boros had drilled into us, a silent language of war, a closed fist for halt, a pointed finger for a point of interest, a flat palm for caution. Every gesture was precise, economical. Words were a liability here. Sound traveled too far. Our first night in the wilds was a lesson in vigilance. We made a cold camp in the lee of a collapsed watchtower, a relic of Lord Darren's fall. We dared not risk a fire. The light would be a beacon for every foul thing in this cursed land. We ate our rations of dried meat and hardtack in the encroaching gloom, the food tasting like dust in our mouths. "First watch is Kalen and me," Boros stated, his voice a low growl that was swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "Gunnar, Alara, get what rest you can. We move at first light." There was no argument. His orders were absolute. While the others settled into their bedrolls, I took my position beside Boros, my back against the cold, crumbling stone of the tower. My shield was planted firmly in the dirt before me, my sword resting across my lap. The darkness in the Plaguelands was not merely an absence of light. It felt substantial. It pressed in, heavy and cloying. The twin moons were obscured by the thick cloud cover, offering only a faint, spectral luminescence that made the twisted landscape seem even more monstrous. Shapes moved in the periphery of my vision, tricks of the light, and an overstrained imagination. But the sounds were real. The faint, wet scraping of something dragging itself through the blighted soil. The distant, mournful howl of a plague rot, a wolf twisted by the blight into a skeletal horror. A soft, insidious whispering that seemed to come from all directions at once. A sibilant murmur just at the edge of hearing. I gripped my sword hilt, my knuckles white. "Easy, lad," Boros murmured, not even looking at me. "The land plays tricks on a mind. Trust your eyes, not your ears. And trust your steel above all." It was a long watch. To keep my mind focused, I went through the litany of protection in my head, the words of familiar anchor in the sea of encroaching dread. I thought of my training, of the shield wall, of the feel of locked shields with my brothers in arms. Courage, I reminded myself, was not the absence of fear. It was the refusal to let fear control you. It was the simple, stubborn act of standing your ground when every instinct screamed at you to run. Boros was a rock beside me, utterly still, his breathing slow and even. He seemed less a man and more a part of the ancient stone we leaned against, immovable and tireless. He had been doing this for more years than I had been alive. This land had not broken him, and I drew strength from his stoic presence. The first clash came shortly after dawn. The gray light had just begun to seep into the world when Gunnar, now on watch, gave a low whistle. Boros and I were instantly awake, weapons in hand. Gunnar pointed with the barrel of his rifle toward a shallow ravine ahead of us. "Movement," he whispered. "5 of them. Ghouls. And they've got a scent." We crept to the edge of the rise and looked down. He was right. 5 hunched, emaciated figures were lurching through the ravine, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were sniffing the air, their heads turning from side to side. They had caught our trail. There was no going around them without losing precious time. "Standard engagement," Boros ordered, his voice crisp. "No noise if we can help it. Alara, stay back. Bless our weapons. Gunnar, take the one on the far right. Kalen, with me." Alara whispered a prayer, and I felt that familiar, faint warmth infuse the steel of my sword. Gunnar rested his rifle on a rock, taking careful aim. Boros and I drew our blades and began to move down the slope, using the terrain for cover. We were a well-oiled machine. The plan was simple. Gunnar's shot would be the signal. He would eliminate the most distant target, and Boros and I would close the gap and deal with the remaining ghouls before they could raise an alarm. The crack of Gunnar's rifle shattered the morning silence. It was a clean shot. The ghoul on the far right collapsed without a sound, a neat hole drilled through its skull. In that same instant, Boros and I charged. The remaining 4 ghouls spun around, their faces masks of feral hunger, their jaws unhinging to let out a guttural shriek. But we were too fast. Boros crashed into the first 2 like a battering ram, his shield sending one flying and his mace crushing the skull of the other in a single, brutal blow. I took the one on the left. It lunged, its filth-caked claws reaching for my face. I caught them on my shield, the impact jarring my arm to the shoulder. I shoved forward, creating an opening, and drove my sword through its chest. The blade grated on bone. It thrashed, its dead eyes staring at me with a vacant malice. I kicked it off my sword and turned to face the last one. This one was larger, more cunning. It dodged Boros's swing and scrambled toward Alara, who was standing her ground, her mace held ready. There was no time to think. I threw myself in its path, my shield up. It slammed into me, the force of it driving me back a step. Its stench was overwhelming, a wave of rot and grave dirt. It snapped at me, its yellowed teeth clicking inches from my face. I held my ground, my feet planted, my shield taking the brunt of its furious assault. This was what I was trained for, to endure, to hold the line. For a moment, we were locked in a grim stalemate. Then Boros was there. His mace came down in a devastating arc, and the creature's head imploded. It collapsed into a heap of twitching limbs and foulness. Silence returned, broken only by our ragged breaths. The clash had lasted less than a minute. It was brutal, efficient, and ugly. Alara moved forward and spoke a quiet prayer over the fallen creatures, a rite of cleansing to ensure they would not rise again. Good work, Boros grunted, wiping his mace on the blighted grass. But they're getting smarter. They were patrolling. Organized, he looked toward the east, his eyes narrowed. The scout was right. Something is stirring out here. Something new. We cleaned our weapons, the acrid scent of undead ichor clinging to the steel. We had adapted. We had survived the first test. But this was just the beginning. Khorne's crossing was still a day's march away, and the feeling of being watched, of walking into a carefully laid trap, was stronger than ever. The stakes had been set, and the cost of failure was a price too terrible to contemplate. As we drew closer to Khorne's crossing, the evidence of a more organized evil became undeniable. We found crude warning signs staked into the ground, rotting heads of wildlife impaled on sharpened poles, their empty eye sockets seeming to watch us pass. We found tracks, not just the shuffling drag of mindless undead, but the clear, booted footprints of humanoids, moving in disciplined patrols. And we found the bodies. Argent Crusaders, their tabards torn and stained, left where they fell. They had not been devoured, as was the ghouls' way. They had been killed with weapons, with dark magic, their bodies left as a clear message. We were not welcome here. This territory had a new master. We crested a low, windswept ridge and finally laid eyes on the town. Khorne's crossing was a skeleton picked clean. The shells of burnt-out houses stood like broken teeth against the gray sky. The town square was a rubble-strewn wasteland, and the spire of its desecrated chapel was tilted at a precarious angle, a broken finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. But it was not abandoned. Figures moved among the ruins. Robed cultists patrolled the perimeter, their hoods pulled low. Abominations, larger and more grotesquely stitched together than any I'd seen before, stood guard at the main road, their massive cleavers resting on their shoulders. A sickly green haze, thicker than the surrounding blight, clung to the center of the town, pulsing with a faint, malevolent light. It emanated from the old town hall, a large, stone building that seemed to be the heart of their operation. Gods above, Gunnar breathed, lowering his spyglass. It's a fortress, he was right. This was no simple scourge infestation. This was an army, an organized, intelligent force. Boros scanned the scene, his face grim. The scout was right, he said, his voice a low rumble. They're not just raising the dead. Look, he pointed toward a makeshift stockade near the town hall. Inside, I could see cages, and in the cages, there were people. Living people. Some wore the tattered remnants of Argent Crusade uniforms. They were prisoners. As we watched, two cultists dragged a man from a cage and hauled him toward the glowing town hall. He was struggling, screaming, but his cries were cut short as the heavy doors slammed shut behind him. A cold dread, far deeper and sharper than the simple fear of combat, settled in my stomach. They were taking prisoners. For what? The scout's dying words echoed in my mind. They're not just raising the dead, they're building them. The horrifying truth of it hit me with the force of a physical blow. They were using living subjects for their vile experiments. They were creating new horrors from the bodies of our own comrades. This was not just a military threat. It was a desecration of the highest order. The mission had changed. This was no longer just reconnaissance. We could not leave our people to that fate. We have to get them out, Ilera whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and righteous fury. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her holy symbol. Boros did not answer immediately. He was the commander, and the weight of the decision rested on his shoulders. Our orders were clear: observe and report. Engaging a force of this size was suicide for a squad of 4. But leaving those prisoners, it was unthinkable. It violated every oath we had ever sworn. I watched his face, saw the conflict in his eyes. He was weighing our lives against our duty, our chances of survival against our honor. It was an impossible choice. We can't fight our way in, Gunnar stated flatly, ever the pragmatist. They'd cut us to pieces before we got halfway to the square. He was right. A frontal assault was out of the question. We needed a plan, something clever, something desperate. We retreated from the ridge and found cover in a cluster of petrified trees to discuss our options. The air was thick with tension. For the first time, I felt a crack in our unity. The sheer scale of the enemy, the horror of what they were doing, it was threatening to overwhelm us. "There must be another way in," I said, my voice hoarse. An old sewer entrance. A collapsed wall. My mind was racing, trying to find a solution, any solution other than walking away. Boros pulled out a worn, leather-bound map of the region, its edges frayed from years of use. He smoothed it out on a flat rock. Corn's Crossing was built on the river. He mused, tracing a line with his finger. There's a culvert system that drains into the Blackwood Creek. It's a long shot, but it might get us inside the perimeter without being seen. It was a sliver of hope, but a sliver was all we had. The revelation of their cruelty had sharpened our purpose, but it had also laid bare the terrible choice before us. We had two objectives, both vital. The first was to free the prisoners, to deny the cultists their raw materials, and save our comrades from a fate worse than death. The second, equally critical, was to find out what was happening inside that town hall. What new form of blight were they creating? What abominations were they designing? That information was vital to the crusade. If we could get inside, find their research, their plans, and destroy them, we could cripple their operation. But we were only 4 people. We could not do both. We would have to choose. We split up, Boros said finally, his voice heavy with the gravity of the decision. It's the only way. My heart sank. Every tenet of military doctrine screamed against it. Splitting a small force in hostile territory was a death sentence. Sergeant, no elara pretestif. We stand together. The shield wall can't be in 2 places at once. Priestess. Boros cut her off, his tone sharp but not unkind. This is the hard math of our duty. He looked at us, his eyes lingering on each face. Alara, you and I will create a diversion at the west gate and try to free the prisoners. Your light will be their best chance. Gunnar, Kalen, you take the culvert. Get into that town hall. Find whatever research you can. Burn it. Burn it all to the ground. Then we meet back at the ridge. If one team isn't there by sunrise, the other gets the hell out and reports back to Hearthglen. No heroics. No exceptions. Is that understood? We all nodded, a grim, silent assent. The choice had been made. We would try to do both. It was a fool's gambit, a desperate throw of the dice. But it was the only choice our honor would allow. We reaffirmed our vows, not with words, but with a shared look of grim understanding. We checked our weapons one last time. I met Gunnar's eyes. He gave me a curt, determined nod. "Watch your back in there, lad," he said, "and try not to get us killed before I get a chance to." His wry humor felt like a tether to the world we had left behind, a world where choices were not so stark, so final. We were no longer just soldiers on a mission. We were instruments of a desperate hope, and the fear I felt was now eclipsed by a cold, burning fire of resolve. We would not let this desecration stand, whatever the cost. The culvert was as foul as I had imagined. It was a narrow, brick-lined tunnel, slick with algae and a century of filth. The stench was overpowering, a thick, gagging mixture of sewage and the pervasive rot of the Plaguelands. We moved in a crouch, the dark, fetid water sloshing around our boots. The only light was a small, enchanted stone Gunnar carried, which cast a weak, flickering glow that seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive darkness just a few feet ahead. Every splash, every dislodged stone, sounded like a thunderclap in the confined space. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the slow, tense progress. Gunnar was ahead of me, his rifle held high to keep it out of the muck. He moved with a surprising stealth for a dwarf, his feet finding purchase on the slippery bricks. My shield felt impossibly cumbersome in the narrow tunnel, constantly scraping against the walls. More than once, I had to unstrap it and carry it, leaving me feeling exposed and vulnerable. We were blind down here, relying on the old map and Boros's hope that this path was still viable. The fear was a living thing, a cold presence at my back, whispering of cave-ins, of creatures lurking in the dark water, of this tunnel becoming our tomb. I focused on the back of Gunnar's cloak, on the steady rhythm of his breathing, and forced myself to keep moving. After what felt like an eternity, we found it, a rusted iron grate set into the ceiling of the tunnel. It was directly below where Boros's map had marked the town hall. This was our entry point. Gunnar passed me the light stone and, with a grunt of effort, reached up and tested the grate. It was heavy, but it shifted. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through me. Working together, we managed to push it aside, the screech of protesting metal setting my teeth on edge. We froze, listening, but there was no sound of alarm from above. Gunnar gave me a leg up, and I cautiously poked my head through the opening. We were in a cellar, a storage room beneath the town hall. It was filled with crates, barrels, and the thick, cloying smell of alchemical reagents. It was blessedly empty. I pulled myself up, then helped haul Gunnar and our gear into the relative safety of the room. The town hall was a place of nightmares. The ground floor was a grotesque laboratory. Long wooden tables were covered with arcane instruments, beakers bubbling with viscous, glowing liquids, and scrolls covered in spidery, necromantic script. But it was the subjects on the tables that made my stomach turn. Body parts, some fresh, some stitched together from multiple sources, lay in grisly arrangements. A disembodied arm twitched, connected by copper wires to a crackling arcane conductor. In a large glass tank, a heart pulsed in a green fluid, a monstrous, unholy beat. This was where they were building their new horrors. This was the heart of the madness. By my ancestor's beard, Gunnar whispered, his face pale beneath his beard. This is foul work. We had to move quickly. We had no idea when Boros and Alara would start their diversion. Our goal was the research, the plans. We began a frantic search of the laboratory, checking scrolls, ledgers, and diagrams. Much of it was incomprehensible to me. Complex magical formulae and anatomical charts that were a perversion of any healer's text. But the intent was clear. They were trying to create a more resilient, more intelligent form of undead. Not just mindless slaves, but soldiers. They were experimenting with infusing the bodies with fell energy, with shadow magic, trying to create abominations that were faster, stronger, and capable of tactical thought. It was the next evolution of the Scourge, born in this cursed place. Suddenly, from outside, we heard a shout, followed by the unmistakable, brilliant flash of holy magic. A wave of concussive force rattled the very foundations of the building. Alara. The diversion had begun. Almost immediately, alarm bells began to ring throughout the town. We heard the heavy tread of booted feet on the floor above us, the guttural roars of abominations being roused. Time was up. We have to burn it all. I hissed, my voice tight with urgency. Gunnar nodded, pulling a small satchel from his belt. It was filled with oil-soaked rags and a flint and steel. Start piling up the scrolls, he ordered, everything that looks important. On the biggest table, we worked with a desperate, frantic energy, gathering the vile research. I grabbed a stack of scrolls detailing the construction of a new type of flesh golem, its pages filled with chillingly precise instructions. As I threw them onto the growing pyre, a sound from the adjoining room caught my attention. A low moan. It was not the sound of an undead creature. It was a sound of human misery. My hand froze. There was someone else down here. Against my better judgment, against the screaming urgency of our mission, I moved toward the sound. I pushed open a heavy wooden door and peered into the darkness beyond. It was a holding cell, and chained to the wall was a single prisoner, an Argent Crusader, his body racked with the signs of early-stage blight infection. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Help me," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. They were going to put me on the table next. My choice was instantaneous and absolute. We were not leaving him. "Gunnar," I called out. "We've got one. Get these chains." The dwarf cursed under his breath, but was at my side in a second. His rifle was slung over his back as he examined the heavy, iron manacles. "These are solid," he grunted. "Can't break him. Quick." He looked from the prisoner to the growing sounds of commotion upstairs. The shouts were getting closer. They knew someone was inside. In that moment, the ordeal began. The door to the cellar crashed open at the top of the stairs, and a hulking shape filled the doorway. It was one of the cult's guards, a brutish warrior in dark plate armor, his face obscured by a skull-faced helmet. He let out a roar and charged down the stairs, a massive two-handed axe in his grip. There was no room to maneuver. Gunnar shoved me forward. "Hold him! I'll get the prisoner!" he yelled, turning his attention back to the chains, his smith hammer now in his hand as he began to strike at the lock. I planted my feet, raised my shield, and met the warrior's charge. The impact was like being hit by a battering ram. The axe crashed against my shield with a deafening clang, and the force of it sent a shuddering shockwave up my arm and through my entire body. My teeth rattled in my skull. I was driven back a step, my boots skidding on the stone floor. The warrior was immensely strong, his blows falling like hammer strikes, relentless and brutal. I could do nothing but defend, turning my body, angling my shield, absorbing the punishment. Sparks flew as his axe scraped down the face of my shield, leaving another deep scar in the steel. Behind me, I could hear Gunnar's frantic hammering on the chains, punctuated by the prisoner's pain grunts. I was losing ground. The warrior was too strong, his assault too ferocious. He was forcing me back, away from Gunnar and the prisoner, trying to isolate me. A blow caught the edge of my shield, knocking it aside for a fraction of a second. It was the opening he needed. The axe swung in a low, vicious arc, aimed at my legs. I tried to leap back, but I was too slow. The blade bit deep into my thigh. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in my leg. I cried out, stumbling, my leg threatening to buckle beneath me. The warrior loomed over me, his axe raised for the killing blow. This is it, I thought. This is where it ends. Then, a deafening roar filled the small room. It was not the sound of the warrior or the abominations upstairs. It was the sound of Gunnar's rifle, fired at point-blank range. The warrior's helmeted head snapped back, a spray of dark fluid erupting from the back of his skull. He stood there for a second, a statue of dark iron, and then crashed to the floor like a felled tree. I sagged against the wall, my hand clamped over the gushing wound in my leg, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. "The chains are off," Gunnar shouted, helping the weakened prisoner to his feet. "But we've got more company." He was right. 2 more cultists were starting down the stairs, their swords drawn. "The fire," I yelled, pushing myself off the wall, my legs screaming in protest. "Light the fire." Gunnar understood. He supported the rescued crusader with one arm, and with the other, he tossed the oil-soaked bundle of rags onto the pile of research. He struck his flint and steel, and with a whoosh, the pile erupted in flames. Acrid smoke immediately began to fill the room. The fire caught quickly, the dry parchment and volatile chemicals creating a raging inferno. We had done it. The research was destroyed. Now we just had to get out alive. The smoke was our only cover. The 2 cultists at the top of the stairs were hesitating, unwilling to charge into the blinding, choking cloud. "The culvert. Now," Gunnar roared. We plunged back into the smoke. I half-limped, half-crawled toward the hole in the floor, the pain in my leg a nauseating, pulsing agony. Gunnar and the prisoner were right behind me. We dropped back into the filth-filled tunnel, the cool, foul water a shock against my wounded leg. Above us, the fire raged, the sound of it mingling with the enraged shouts of the cultists. We had struck a blow. We had hurt them, but the cost was already mounting. Gunnar had used his one shot. I was grievously wounded, and we had no idea what fate had befallen Boros and Alara. We had only completed half the mission, and it had already almost destroyed us. We scrambled back into the darkness of the tunnel, the light of our success a raging fire at our backs, and the uncertainty of our escape a suffocating darkness ahead. The retreat through the culvert was a nightmare journey through my own personal hell. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony shooting up my leg. The cold, filthy water did nothing to numb the pain. It only seemed to make the wound throb with a deeper, more profound ache. The rescued crusader, whose name I learned was Theron, was weak, barely able to stand. Gunnar, a dwarf of incredible fortitude, practically carried the both of us, his own breath coming in ragged pants, his face set in a grim mask of determination. The smoke from the fire had followed us into the tunnel, and soon we were choking on it, our eyes streaming. We were a sorry trio, wounded and exhausted, stumbling through the dark. When we finally emerged back into the gray light of the Plaguelands, I collapsed onto the blighted soil, gasping for air that did not taste of smoke and filth. The sounds of the battle we had left behind were still audible. Shouts, the clang of steel, the unholy roar of abominations. But there was another sound, too. The sound of Alera's voice, raised not in a prayer of healing, but in a battle cry, a raw, powerful shout of defiance that ended in a blinding flash of light from the direction of the town's west gate. Even from this distance, we felt the tremor in the ground. She had unleashed something powerful, a desperate final gambit. Then silence. A heavy, dreadful silence that was worse than the noise of battle. "We have to go," Gunnar said, his voice strained. He was already tending to my leg, tearing a strip of cloth from his cloak to make a crude bandage. "We stick to the plan. Rendezvous at the ridge." He hauled me to my feet, and I leaned on him, my arms slung over his broad shoulders. Theron, though weak, found a reserve of strength and managed to walk on his own. We began the slow, agonizing trek back to the rendezvous point. Every step was a fresh torment. My vision swam, and the world seemed to tilt and sway. The only thing that kept me moving was the thought of the plan, of Boros's final order. Meet at the ridge. Sunrise. We reached the ridge as the first, weak rays of the sun began to pierce the gloom. The sky to the east was the color of a fresh bruise. We scanned the landscape, our eyes desperately searching for any sign of Boros and Alera. The town of Corrin's Crossing was a hive of activity, but it was the activity of an angered nest, not a victorious army. Smoke still billowed from the town hall. Cultists were searching the perimeter, their movements angry and agitated. Our fire had done its work, but there was no sign of our comrades. We waited. The sun climbed higher, a pale, indifferent disk in the sky. The silence from our friends was absolute. Sunrise came and went. Boros and Alera did not appear. The hard math of our duty, Boros had called it. The finality of his order settled upon us with the weight of a burial shroud. If one team isn't there by sunrise, the other gets the hell out. No heroics, no exceptions. It was the hardest order I had ever had to follow. To turn our backs, to leave them behind, felt like a betrayal. But it was what Boros would have wanted. It was what he had commanded. The information we had, the prisoner we had saved, that had to make it back to Hearthglen. Their sacrifice had to mean something. Gunnar looked at me, his face etched with a grief so profound it seemed to crack his stony dwarven features. "It's time, lad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have to go." I could only nod, a lump of ice in my throat. We took one last look at the cursed town, a silent farewell to the sergeant who had been our rock and the priestess who had been our light. The cost of our small victory was immense. We had lost half of our squad, our family. We had lost our leader. We had paid in blood and sorrow for a handful of burnt papers and one rescued life. I do not know if it was a fair trade. I only knew that we had to honor it. The journey back to Hearthglen was a long, harrowing blur of pain and fear. My wound festered, and a fever began to set in. I drifted in and out of consciousness, leaning heavily on Gunnar, who seemed to be powered by sheer, stubborn will. Theron, despite his own weakness, helped as much as he could, taking turns scouting ahead. We were hunted. The cultists were enraged, and their patrols scoured the countryside for us. More than once, we had to hide in ditches or behind stands of dead trees, holding our breath as a patrol passed mere yards away. We moved mostly at night, the darkness our only ally. During the day, we would find what shelter we could and rest, though sleep was a luxury filled with nightmares. In my feverish state, I saw Boros's face, heard his voice telling me to stand firm, to hold the line. I saw Alera, her hands glowing with a light that was being consumed by shadows. I felt the crushing weight of my failure. I had held my line in the cellar, but what of the larger battle? What good was my shield if it could not protect my friends? These thoughts were a poison, weakening me as much as the blight in my wound. It was Gunnar who kept me going. He cleaned my wound with what little fresh water we had, forced me to eat, and spoke to me in a low, gruff voice whenever my spirit began to falter. "You're not die on me, lad," he would grumble. "Boros didn't die, so you could give up in a ditch. We're getting back. We're going to tell them what he did. What they both did. That's the duty now." His words were a bucket of cold water, shocking me back to the present, back to the grim task at hand. He was right. Our survival was now the memorial. We finally saw the walls of Hearthglen on the third day. The sight of the Argent Crusade's banners, snapping in the wind, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The last few hundred yards were the hardest. I stumbled, my strength completely gone. Gunnar and Theron had to half carry, half drag me to the gate. The guards, seeing our state, raised the alarm, and the portcullis was raised. We staggered inside, and I collapsed onto the familiar, solid flagstones of the courtyard. Healers rushed to my side. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me completely was the face of High Lord Fordring, looking down at us, his expression a mixture of relief, sorrow, and grim understanding. We were back. We had survived. But the roar of the battle was over, and now came the quiet, crushing weight of its aftermath. I awoke in the infirmary. The blessed scent of clean linen and healing herbs replaced the stench of death and decay that had been my world for the past week. My leg was bandaged, the throbbing pain reduced to a dull, persistent ache. The fever had broken. Alara's teachings had not been in vain. The healers here were skilled, their use of the light a gentle, restorative miracle. I lay there for a long time, simply breathing, feeling the solidness of the cot beneath me, listening to the muted sounds of the keep. It was a world away from the horrors of Corrin's Crossing. It was a world Boros and Alara would never see again. Gunnar was sitting in a chair by my bedside. He was cleaning his rifle, the familiar, methodical clicks and scrapes a comforting sound. He looked up as I stirred. "About time you woke up, sleepyhead," he said, his attempt at a jest falling flat. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face seemed to have aged a decade. "Theron is recovering. The healers say he'll make a full recovery. They purged the blight from him." He paused, his hands stilling on the rifle. "They're calling us heroes," he said the word with a quiet, bitter contempt. "We gave our report to the High Lord. All of it. The labs, the research, the prisoners. The loss of Boros and Alara. We did not speak of what happened at the West Gate. We did not need to. We both knew. They had sold their lives to buy us time. Boros, the immovable shield, holding a choke point against impossible odds. Alara, the gentle priestess, unleashing a final, desperate act of holy fire to scatter the enemy and cover our escape. They had done their duty to the very end. Their sacrifice was the reason we were alive, the reason the Crusade now knew the truth of the threat brewing in the East. They were heroes. We were just the ones who had to live with it. Later that day, I was summoned to give my own account to the High Lord. Supported by a crutch, I made my way to the command center. Tyrion Fordring stood before a large map of the Plaguelands, his gaze fixed on the spot marked Corrin's Crossing. He listened patiently as I recounted our story, my voice hoarse and unsteady. I told him everything: the culvert, the laboratory, the warrior in the cellar, Gunnar's shot, the fire. When I spoke of Boros's final order, of our retreat at sunrise, my voice broke. I had followed my orders, but I felt like a deserter. Fordring placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. His eyes, wise and weary, met mine. "You did not desert them, son," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet authority. "You honored them. You completed the mission. Because of you and your squad, we now know what we are facing. We can prepare. We can fight back." Their lives were not spent in vain. They were spent for a purpose. Never forget that. His words were a balm, not erasing the grief, but giving it shape, giving it meaning. He told me that Theron's testimony had corroborated everything. The cult, calling themselves the Risen Flesh, was indeed led by a powerful necromancer from the fallen house of Barov, a former instructor at Scholomance who sought to perfect the work of the Lich King. Our actions had been a major setback to his plans. We consolidated what we had won. The information was disseminated. New patrols were organized, new defenses planned. The crusade was mobilizing, preparing for a full-scale assault on Khorne's Crossing. The knowledge we had brought back, paid for so dearly, was being turned into a weapon. We had held our ground, tended our wounded, and honored our fallen. A small, private service was held for Boros and Alara in the chapel. It was not a grand affair. It was a quiet gathering of those who had known them. Gunnar and I stood side by side. I did not weep. The grief was a hard, cold knot in my chest, too deep for tears. I simply stood there, my hand resting on the pommel of my sword, and remembered. I remembered Boros's gruff wisdom, the safety of standing beside him in the shield wall. I remembered Alara's unwavering faith, the warmth of her light in the oppressive dark. The report was made, the losses accounted for. But so much remained unknown. How many more labs like that one were hidden in the Plaguelands? How far had the risen flesh spread their influence? Our small victory felt like holding back a single wave in an overwhelming tide. We had won a battle, but the war, the endless, grinding war for the soul of this land, raged on. The quiet after the storm was not peaceful. It was a tense, watchful silence, the silence of a soldier waiting for the next call to arms. It was the silence of knowing that the enemy was still out there, rebuilding, plotting, and waiting. The ordeal had changed me. The Plaguelands were no longer just a cursed landscape I was tasked to cleanse. They were a personal battleground, a place where I had lost part of myself. I had learned a hard lesson in that cellar, a lesson written in steel and blood. I understood now that honor was not found in glorious charges or triumphant victories. It was found in the grim choices, in the sacrifices made in the dark, in the quiet determination to keep fighting when all hope seems lost. It was found in the courage to follow an order that breaks your heart, because the mission, the lives of others, depended on it. My faith, once a flickering candle, had been tested in a gale. It was not extinguished. Instead, the flame now burned with a different quality. Not the bright, hopeful fire of Alara's faith, but a cold, hard, blue flame of pure resolve. A few days later, my leg had healed enough for me to walk without the crutch. I went to the training yard, the place where my journey had, in a way, truly begun. I picked up my shield. It was battered, the deep gash from the warrior's axe a fresh, ugly wound on its face. But it had not broken. It had held, just as Boros had taught me. I looked out over the walls, toward the east, where the gray haze still hung over the horizon. The crusade was gathering its strength. Soon, they would march on Khorne's Crossing. They would need every soldier, every shield. My duty was not over. It had just been given a new, sharper focus. I thought of Boros and Alara, and a quiet oath formed in my heart, a promise to their memory. I would not let their sacrifice be for nothing. I would stand in the shield wall. I would hold the line. I would be the steel that protected the light. I hefted the shield, its weight familiar and right. The fear was still there, a cold companion in the back of my mind, but it no longer held any power over me. I had faced a true threat. I had paid the cost, and I had endured. My resolve was forged anew in the fires of that hellish laboratory. What was preserved was a chance for the living to fight back, to reclaim what was lost. What was lost was irreplaceable. Good soldiers, dear friends. The price of our survival, of our small victory, was a debt that could only be repaid in continued service. My oath was renewed, no longer just a pledge to a distant cause, but a personal vow, sealed in the memory of the fallen. I would see this through to the end. I would see Lordaeron cleansed, or I would die on its blighted soil trying. Tomorrow, I march again.